It's often better to wait for a game to come out and look at reviews before buying a game. What people get can differ from what developers promise. And if you're not convinced, here's 10 games from recent years notable for their negative reception.
I won't let him take me again.
Contact! Here we go!
Aliens Colonial Marines was a first-person shooter developed by Gearbox and set within the Alien universe after the events of Alien 3. It came out in 2013 and is one of the most notorious games released in recent years. Despite being described as a canon sequel, its story was inconsistent with the Alien films, and that's not the most minor concern. Its gameplay suffered from bugs, bad AI, weak multiplayer, and more. The graphics were significantly worse than seen in promotional materials, even videos claiming to show gameplay, to the point where a lawsuit was filed against Gearbox and Sega for false advertising. Some sources claim work on Colonial Marines was outsourced, contributing to its numerous issues. Whatever the case may be, Aliens Colonial Marines was a disaster. With reviews averaging in the 40s, it casts a shadow over the Alien franchise until the much more successful Alien Isolation launched in 2014. The Tony Hawk's skateboarding games are immensely popular, and fans of the series are used to top-notch games. So how did Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, which came out in 2015, end up with review scores in the 30s when its predecessors scored in the 90s? Bugs, environmental glitches, physics problems, bland levels, simple missions, weak mechanics, design flaws, lack of secrets, and dull online content all made Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 a game players felt was barely enjoyable on its own, let alone when compared to previous games in the series. An eventual update fixed some of the issues and added new content, but it was too little too late in the eyes of fans. Another game players and critics score soundly in the 30s attempted to capitalize on the popularity of a certain TV show. The Walking Dead Survival Instinct was a first-person shooter written as a prequel to The Walking Dead show, starring Daryl. Unfortunately, fans didn't find much to love in it. Its story was criticized for being weak and unmemorable, with little emotional connection to the characters. It was meant to be a stealth game, but its broken stealth mechanics often made it more viable to run past enemies instead, and the rest of its mechanics were equally broken or dull. Even Robert Kirkman, the creator of The Walking Dead, distanced himself from Survival Instinct when asked about it during a Reddit Ask Me Anything session. A stealth survival game based on the Walking Dead TV show could have been great. Unfortunately, The Walking Dead Survival Instinct was not. Sonic the Hedgehog fans have not been a happy bunch lately, and nothing shows that more clearly than 2014's Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric, a Wii U exclusive that holds a Metacritic score of 32. Sonic Boom is a spin-off franchise made up of an animated show, a comic series, a line of toys, a 3DS game called Sonic Boom: Shattered Crystal, which also received a dismal reception, but not this bad, and the disaster called Rise of Lyric. Rise of Lyric was criticized for, well, everything. Its story, poorly written with bad dialogue and worse jokes. Its graphics, low quality. Controls, unwieldy and unresponsive. Gameplay, repetitive, dull and unpolished, with a problematic camera. Add in numerous bugs and glitches, and many people declared it to be the worst Sonic game of all time. Its sales at least reflect that. By May 2015, the two Sonic Boom games had sold a combined total of 620,000 copies, making them the worst-selling entries in the Sonic history. Mysteriously, Sega is still going for it. A sequel to Shattered Crystal is due out in September 2016. Maybe it can redeem the series. In 2013, Square Enix released a Final Fantasy spin-off for mobile devices called Final Fantasy All the Bravest. The Juggernaut RPG series has made some missteps over the years, but how bad could All the Bravest be? Bad. Very bad. Its average review scores were in the 20s, and most people felt fans should stay far, far away. Final Fantasy All the Bravest showed mobile gaming at its worst. Simple, shallow gameplay mechanics meant it gave players little to enjoy. It didn't have a story, and its in-app purchase system was so blatant and extreme, critics slammed it as an attempt to exploit fans. Critics deal with bad games all the time, but prior to its official review, IGN even posted a video with the title, "PSA, don't buy Final Fantasy All the Bravest." Nothing says negative reception like a public service announcement against the game. At least Square Enix seems to have learnt its lesson. Subsequent mobile Final Fantasy spin-offs like Record Keeper and Brave Exvius backed away from All the Bravest's mistakes and proved to be much more enjoyable games.
Oh shit.
All three Postal games have received somewhat mixed reviews, but none to the extent of Postal 3. Its average score was 24 due to poor design, bad AI, repetitive levels, and an unfortunate number of bugs. Postal 3 had a troubled development. Franchise owner and developer, Running with Scissors, licensed it to the publisher Akela, and Postal 3 was then developed by Trash Master Studio. This proved to be a mistake. Akela ran into trouble, and the game, eventually released in 2011, was nowhere near the initial vision for Postal 3. But the most telling thing about Postal 3's negative reception is how Running with Scissors responded to it. Running with Scissors removed Postal 3 from their own store. They stopped considering it a main series title, describing it instead as a dodgy spin-off that should never have happened. They then created an expansion for Postal 2 called Paradise Lost, which reveals the events of Postal 3 was just a nightmare had by the Postal dude. Postal 2 Paradise Lost takes another jab at Postal 3 through a house you can break into. Inside, you'll find a Postal 3 player who has hanged himself. The game is frozen on his computer, along with an error message that presents two options: wait for the game to get better, or uninstall and install Postal 2 and hope for Postal 4. You know a game is bad when the series' developers react to it so harshly. The Kinect has a poor reputation, and games like Fighter Within are the reason why. Fighter Within was a launch title for the Xbox One, but the Xbox One probably would have been better off without it. This fighting game was designed to use the Kinect's motion detection to let players control the actual punches. In theory, it's a good idea. In practice, well, let's just say games like this needs its motion detection to work. Fighter Within's motion detection was utterly broken. It barely recognized anything but the most basic moves, and sometimes registered motion even when the player was standing still. A terrible story and long loading times just made matters worse. It ended up with an average review score of 23, and yes, its placement on this list means there are 3 recent games even worse than a motion controlled game with broken motion controls. The story behind Infestation Survivor Stories is so messy you might not even know the game by this title. But do you remember an open-world zombie survival game called The War Z? After spending a couple months in alpha testing, The War Z was released on Steam in December 2012, and chaos ensued. The War Z was essentially a beta, despite being advertised as a finished game. Its store page promised private servers with a 100-player cap, large maps, skills, and a hardcore mode, none of which were actually in the game yet. It also had a heavy emphasis on microtransactions, and no, it wasn't a free-to-play game. Meanwhile, Its terms of use, which appeared to have been largely copied from League of Legends, since the agreement actually contained a League of Legends URL within it, included an insane clause that said you waived your right to a refund once you accepted the agreement. Steam removed the game from its storefront 2 days after its launch and issued refunds to players. The War Z eventually returned to Steam in 2013. It changed its title to Infestation Survivor Stories, possibly to avoid accusations of copying DayZ, and possibly just to distance itself from its controversy. However, with a Metacritic score of 20 and negative reviews on Steam, it doesn't look like the changes were enough to save it. If you are a sports fan lamenting the lack of rugby video games, don't get Rugby 15. Rugby 15's average score was a 20, with a general recommendation to avoid it at all costs. If you're unfamiliar with the sport, Rugby 15 will come across as a poorly designed, buggy game with awful mechanics. If you are familiar with the sport, it will come across as a poorly designed, buggy game with awful mechanics and very little resemblance to anything found in actual rugby. Rugby 15 has a very special honour. It has the lowest Metacritic score of any Xbox One or PlayStation 4 game. That says something. But in 2013, the previous generation of consoles had the dubious pleasure of seeing a game even worse than anything else on this list. But before we get to our final pick, here's an honourable mention. Before we get to number 1, there's one polarising game I have to mention: No Man's Sky. This game was a victim of its own hype, with discussion about its successes and failures continuing well after release. It's definitely left an impact on the gaming world as an example of hype culture gone wrong, and expectation versus reality. The only thing stopping me from giving it a solid spot on this list is that it does have some redeeming qualities and is praised for certain aspects. However, its negative response gives it a solid honourable mention before number 1. We've looked at a lot of games with negative reception so far, but nothing comes close to Ride to Hell Retribution. Ride to Hell's average score is in the teens. No critic gave it a positive review, or even one that Metacritic would even consider mixed. Even if you don't put much stock in Metacritic, people still considered this to be one of the worst games ever. Ride to Hell Retribution was playable, although its gameplay was broken and its controls were frustrating. Although it dubiously followed a story, it had bad voice acting to accompany terrible writing. And while you might see some ill-conceived logic in having the protagonist replenish his health and ammo by having sex, the fully clothed sex scenes were as baffling as everything else in the game. Quite simply, the majority of players couldn't find anything to like about Ride to Hell. Reviewers' descriptions of it included phrases like an abomination and nonsensical design choices. One critic summed it up with, "I don't think there's ever been a game that does so many things so universally poorly." There is some thought that Ride to Hell Retribution might become a so bad it's good game, beloved for just how awful it is. Whether or not that happens, when it comes to recent games notable for negative reception, Ride to Hell Retribution stands at the top of the list. I hope you enjoyed this week's list, and if you did, leave a like. And if you want to see more lists now, click here for my top 10 bizarre survival horror puzzles, or here for my top 10 biggest video game box art errors. And if you want to see more in the future, subscribe.